Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the columnist at The Eye, Ian Dunt, and the deputy political editor at The Spectator, Katy Balls, with us from now until just before midnight. Welcome to both of you. So, no guess is then what the lead story is for many of newspapers. Number 10, Partygate shame. PM and the Chancellor broke the law. That is the headline on the front page of the Metro, after Boris Johnson, his wife and Rishi Sunak were fined for attending illegal Downing Street parties during lockdown. The Financial Times says the fines have piled more political pressure on both men, and with the police investigation continuing, there could yet be more fines. The Eye too reminding us that it may not be over as far as the fines are concerned, and says 57% of people want Mr Johnson to resign. The Telegraph quotes Mr Johnson from his latest apology. People have a right to expect better. He has, though, again refused to resign. That is also the lead story for The Times. Johnson refuses to quit, they say. The Guardian goes with that angle too. I broke my own law, but I refuse to go. The Mail asks, don't they know there's a war on, attacking what it calls the left, howling for resignations when there are more important things to consider. As The Sun puts it, I'm sorry, but I have work to do. But the Mirror's view is clear. The country is led by liars and lawbreakers. Quick reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out those front pages while you watch us. So let's bring in our guests once again, joined by Ian Dunt and Katy Balls. Welcome to both of you. Katy, what a day. What does this all mean? Let's start with the Metro, shall we? The basic story there, the PM and the Chancellor broke the law.
Yes, and this is Prime Minister defies calls to quit as police fine them for attending bash in lockdown. Now, we never quite knew when we'd hear about certain fines being announced. They've become in batches. I think that's been a frustration to many in government because there was a drip nature to it. So this is a second batch of fines, and we were told in advance that the Prime Minister received one, number 10 would tell us. And I think there was a sense that the Prime Minister could get one, given that he's being looked at for several events. I think probably the biggest surprise today is that Rishi Sunak also received a fine. Now, this all relates, as did Carrie Johnson, the Prime Minister's wife, and this all relates in the terms of this batch of fines to an event in Downing Street. Those there insist it was very brief, but involved birthday cake, singing happy birthday. And where does it go from here? I think that if you think about all the various denials we've had for, if you go back to the start of Partygate, where it wasn't really a mainstream story to begin with, it was the Mirror first pushing it, broadcasters picked up on it. And in the early stages, you had repeated denials from Downing Street. There was nothing to see there. So I think just take a step back and look at how far the story has gone. We've gone from suggestions of, nothing at all to the fact that the two most senior members of government have now been fined by the police. And therefore, it's a pretty damning assessment of, A, the messaging around this in the beginning, but two, what actually went on in Downing Street during lockdown and how it was cultural.
Yes, and as you might expect, the Mirror is pretty blunt, led by liars and lawbreakers. The statement, Ian, from Boris Johnson today said it did not occur to him that the gathering in the Cabinet room in June 2020 to mark his 56th birthday was a violation of coronavirus rules, but that he now humbly accepts he did breach COVID-19 laws. Never mind being a liar, why did it not occur to him?
Well, it did occur to him. He's lying about it now. I mean, there's no way you can take any of this stuff seriously. I mean, we knew exactly what we were going through at the time. No one was under any illusions as to how the rules operated. It was the subject of conversation every day, anytime you were discussing anything at all. No one thought that you could have a birthday party with your partner and your work colleagues and cake whenever you liked. Nobody thought that, let alone the person that wrote the law. So I mean, for him to say it now isn't just morally abysmal, but it's kind of like, it's like a libel against our intellect. He is treating us like absolute fools. So even now, even when he's banged to rights, he still comes out with it. Just more lies. It's like this endless conveyor belt of lies. So certainly he was never under any illusions as to what he was doing. He just didn't care.
Well, we had it again today and at the time too, when these allegations first broke, that Downing Street is a unique environment. It's both the Prime Minister's office and his home. It's a rabbit warren of rooms. Everyone's cheek by jowl. Everyone was working really hard. You know, does any of this stack up, Katy, or do we just move on from the defence of this, and even the defence of this specific incident, that he was ambushed by a cake?
So there have been various defences. I think that when we've heard various number 10 figures, often anonymously saying, well, we're working really hard, I think that's one of the weakest defences, because a lot of people during the pandemic felt like they were working very hard, often alone in really difficult situations. And I think that's one that doesn't garner much sympathy. I think in terms of the various incidents and alleged parties that the police are looking into, I do think that this instance of the birthday cake is probably on a different level than some of the others. For example, alleged karaoke parties, people having a disco. Now, we can say they all break the rules, but I think certain ones will probably make members of the public more angry than others. Obviously, any rule breach is bad, but I don't think on the scale, I think this is on the lower end, which does beg the question about what's to come next. I think in terms of what the Prime Minister has said, we are actually seeing an apology today, but if we think about recent weeks when the police first did the first batch of fines, it hasn't been that clear that number 10 is always apologetic. So we've had various briefings from the Prime Minister's spokesperson, but they've suggested that, for example, they don't necessarily accept the Met Police's findings. Now it seems that they do accept it. But I think, as ever with Boris Johnson, there is a sense that perhaps he is apologetic in some ways, but also you do get the sense from those around him that they still are quite frustrated that the whole thing has played out like this. And there is quite a lot of anger towards the Met Police at the way in which this is being fed out in various batches.
Well, the Daily Mail front page picks up on that, the idea that this is the lower end of the scale of offences, if you like. Boris was there for 9 minutes, Carrie less than 5. The birthday cake never left its Tupperware box, and last night the PM rightly apologised. As the left howls for resignations over the Met's £50 COVID fines, don't they know there's a war on? Now, it seems like from that Conservative-leaning paper, he will survive this, Ian.
I don't know whether he'll survive or not, certainly not because of the Mail. What I do know is that that is just the most grotesque combination of gibbering lunacies and lack of standards that I've seen on the front page of a British newspaper for a very long time. The basic facts of it are that he passed laws that he then broke. I mean, you have to go back to John Locke to try and find the philosophical arguments for why our societies are based on the idea that the executive follows the laws that it passes. That's what the rule of law is all about. Start talking about how long a cake was in a Tupperware box is to completely misunderstand what this is about. So it doesn't matter to the people who weren't able to visit their families, their loved ones that were dying, while they were engaging in this kind of activity. And then as the kind of cherry on the cake of this abject nonsense, to start using the war in Ukraine as some kind of shield to conceal the moral culpability of the government here, shows absolutely no respect for what Ukrainians themselves are going to. They deserve better than to be used as shields in this particular regard. And frankly, I mean, I have to say, I'm not a big believer in the Mail. It's had good moments at certain points. That front page is an absolutely shameful, shoddy piece of work.
Well, the Ukraine war seems to be working for many, including people like Sir Roger Gale, others who put letters in that say now is not the time. Daily Telegraph points out that 14 cabinet ministers offered public support to the Prime Minister, including Michael Gove, Sajid Javid, Liz Truss, etc., etc. I mean, the Conservative Party, in a sense, senses the time has passed, Katy.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think back to 2 months ago, had the police announced a fine 2 months ago, I think we'd be at the point of counting the number of letters that we thought were currently into Graham Brady, the chair of the 1922 chairman. So a lot has changed. I think as one senior Tory said to me earlier today, the Prime Minister is now in a much better place to try and survive this than he was a few months ago. Does that mean all trouble is past? I don't think so. And I think that, yes, the Ukraine crisis, the fact there is a war on, has given lots of MPs a sense of perspective and made them wonder if they should write off a Prime Minister over a cake, whether it's in a box or out the box. But I still think there's plenty of risk here for the Prime Minister. And actually the messaging from number 10 has to be pretty careful here, because I think there is a lot of upset still. And if it looks as though Boris Johnson and his team are dismissing the anger that lots of people feel, because this is still quite raw for people who gave up things during that period when number 10 appeared to have been doing plenty of things, it could still come back to bite the Prime Minister.
OK, plenty more on that to come. In fact, the Telegraph picks up on that point too, suggesting that Whitehall is braced for the release of the full report into Partygate by Sue Gray. Sources have told the Daily Telegraph that the dossier will be critical of Mr Johnson's conduct and will make for uncomfortable reading for him and a number of senior Whitehall figures. We'll certainly talk more about that after the break, and included what happens next for Rishi Sunak after his difficult week. Back with that in just a moment. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Joining me once again, the columnist at the newspaper, Ian Dunt, and the deputy political editor at the Spectator, Katy Balls. Welcome back to both of you. Final mention on Partygate, Katy, if you don't mind, which is Rishi Sunak, pictured on the front page of The Guardian, one step behind the Prime Minister there, and also referred to on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, with Camilla Tominey suggesting once the government's golden boy, the Chancellor could be forgiven for wondering how on earth he has suddenly become its resident sponge, absorbing many of Downing Street's woes right now, with the headline beneath their lead story, after the Chancellor's recent woes, this is the icing on the cake. Now, what happens to him?
Yes, I mean, this is a really interesting case, I think, in the sense that no one really expected Rishi Sunak to receive a fine, or at least it's come as a surprise to many in Westminster. I think we can include the Chancellor in that. And therefore, what happens next? Now, I think that Rishi Sunak's already had a torrid few weeks. Ever since the spring statement, his popularity has plummeted. And then you've had questions about his wife's tax affairs, his possession of a green card early on in his time as Chancellor. And I think it's just adding to the sense that he is no longer seen as the heir apparent, the obvious successor to Boris Johnson. Where that changes things on Partygate is, I think it's another reason Boris Johnson may be safe for the time being, because the idea of a Tory leadership contest when you're not quite sure who is going to win or who the favourite is puts off a lot of Tory MPs.
And to the story that would probably have been our lead had it not been for the news on the fines, Ian, also on the front page of the Daily Telegraph and the Times, in fact. The US has credible information that Russia may use chemical agents in its push to take Mariupol, according to the US Secretary of State. And this after the UK said it was looking at claims that Russia had already used chemical weapons. This is clearly a very serious story still.
Yeah, look, I mean, the US intelligence over this period has been pretty impeccable, quite unlike the kind of intelligence we get from them on the Middle East. It's been sound, it's been well ahead of the curve, so we start taking it very seriously. We also know that this is what Putin does. This is the kind of thing defended in Syria. He is a butcher and a murderer, and when things don't go his way, strategically, logistically, operationally, one of the things he is liable to do is to descend into ever greater levels of depravity and barbarism as he tries to bludgeon opponents into submission. So it all seems entirely convincing and, of course, extremely troubling.
Ian, Katy, thank you both very much indeed.